Greetings, I'm Matt Thurlow, the Executive Director of the Decorative Arts Trust. Although I'm sad to miss another year of Antiques Forum fun, the Trust is pleased to once again sponsor the Young Scholars Lecture. Hannah Boettcher is the Manager of Special Programs at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. She received her MA in the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture and a BFA in Painting and Art History from Washington University in St. Louis. Her lecture for Antiques Forum is tied to an article in the 2020 edition of Chipstone Foundation's Ceramics in America. Co-authored with Ron Fuchs, the essay, Martha Washington's United States China, a new link found in a family notebook, continues her MA thesis research from Winterthur, as well as work for the first Oval Office project at the Museum of the American Revolution. Boettcher was a Decorative Arts of the Gulf South Fellow with the Historic New Orleans Collection in 2015. Thank you for your support of Antiques Forum and the Historic New Orleans Collection. And to learn more about the Decorative Arts Trust, visit decorativeartstrust.org. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the New Orleans Antiques Forum. My name is Hannah Boettcher, and I'm joining you from Philadelphia, where I work at the Museum of the American Revolution. My talk is informed by research I started in the Winterthur program in American Material Culture about this house, Arlington, and its massive social network of people, places, and things that connect American memories of the Revolutionary War when it was built in the 1800s, it overlooks Arlington Heights and Washington, D.C., and is pretty close to Alexandria if you've never been there before. And it's connecting memories of the Revolutionary War when it was built in the 1800s. And by the time that its last private residents fled in 1861, it faced incredibly divided Civil War sentiments. Here, Martha Washington's descendants through her first husband managed a truly assorted collection of items. Some plates, an old lantern, silver, furniture, ceramics, military items, random party favors, and more than one war tent, all originally used at Mount Vernon. As a fellow with the Decorative Arts Gulf South Survey, I got to catalog antiques and pull open drawers of papers that proved how rapidly this Virginia family promoted buzz about George and Martha Washington's significance on a national scale, using their Arlington collection. They mailed autographs, buttons, and curiosities to true fans who treasured these mementos. For those who saw the Washingtons as larger than life luminaries, accepting an invitation to see this stuff at Arlington would have been worth the trip. Here, Arlington's founder, George Washington Parke Custis, has endorsed an engraving of his adopted father, this famous portrait by Charles Willson Peale, and it was displayed, we just saw it displayed in a house in Mississippi. Luckily, we can still read this family's fan mail and occasional hate mail to compare a local news and national news version of the Washington Custis Lee family gossip about the things they lived with. Talking to the press about the Relics stories was a political power move for the first family. After Martha's death in 1802, these objects as witnesses to everyday life at Mount Vernon could make for great gifts to private individuals, patriotic causes, and even public institutions. Generations of women at Arlington, free and enslaved, curated these objects to symbolize family, state, and national pride before and after the Civil War. Their actions impact where we can see these items today as iconic artifacts and not just random household furnishings in museums. One item from this famous and infamous family collection has been the largest piece of the museum I work at since it first was a proud purchase by our founder for a new museum at Valley Forge in 1909. I'll introduce you to its last private owner, Mary Custis Lee, who sold it to fundraise for her charity, the Home for Needy Confederate Women in Richmond, and inherited concerns about provenance research and collections care from stories she overheard while growing up at her grandfather's plantation in Arlington. Since I'm in good company today with fellow museum fans, we can all appreciate that when there are many more museums today than when she sold this tent. When visitors see it in the Allen B. Miller Theater, they might compare it to seeing national icons like the Star-Spangled Banner at the Smithsonian. You and I know that this kind of display is completely on purpose. My colleagues have counted the hours of light exposure on this tent since the museum opened in 2017, which is kept to conservation standards and part of a film known to bring people to tears almost every hour. And it's in a much bigger fireproof case and meets more people than Mary could have ever imagined. This tent's usually interpreted, as you might guess, for surviving the Revolutionary War, but these giant pieces of linen and the other relics also had to survive the Civil War at Arlington. Both wars were especially close to home and inspired fast-paced decisions to inventory and protect the items from becoming spoils of war. As a result, these objects' origins have twisting plot points with enough secrets and missing pieces to make the next National Treasure movie. So just let me know if you're making that and I'll tell you more about it. Mary was used to media attention as General Robert E. Lee's eldest daughter and a descendant of Martha Washington, and often reached for public comment on both topics and even at the end of her life about World War I. She, over time, saw museum buildings become much more professional settings to showcase artifacts than private mansions like Arlington. But she often told reporters that she'd grown up in a museum long before she saw her heirlooms on view at the Centennial. Here we can actually see the tent in its leather carrying case, which I think could be a good first relic to talk about. Is it harder to appreciate this tent when it's wrapped in this snuggly container? This portmanteau was packaged with our museum's purchase. Mary's grandfather Custis wrote in white paint on it to mark its presence with Washington at Dorchester Heights to Yorktown. However, when Colonial Williamsburg Trades Department replicated this in the last few years, they figured out that this case might not have held all the tent pieces. The fact that camping equipment could be considered a relic might really surprise people who think of relics as something made of precious metal or maybe even human hair, as sacred objects worth taking a pilgrimage to see. 19th century people used relics as another word for artifact. I'll return to this object after talking about earlier puzzles solved by the family. My favorite sources to unpack on this topic come from unpacking this trunk in the collection at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond. Discovered in a bank vault less than 20 years ago, Mary Custis Lee used this luxury luggage as the family archive to keep 300 years of family papers. We can guess why she held on to those pieces of her father's uniform and this really cool invitation to Mardi Gras in 1884. But why does she have these two cut up stereo cards of Virginia estates? Well, they're her ancestral homes, Mount Vernon and Arlington, and maybe she took time to remember them while on her travels. She chose to live abroad and alone for her entire life, so she's always traveling to Italy or India or New Zealand. Not having a home of her own makes it even more interesting that Mary was the last person to care for the stuff that makes up these two very highly visited house museums today. The Custis Lee family and the people enslaved by them at both of these sites acted to shape why we think of these places as patriotic landscapes, long before many of us might be able to name a specific furnishing as a relic worth visiting on its own. These homes might be more famous as American national icons than the things they contain, which wasn't always the case. Operated as Arlington House, a national park called Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial within Arlington National Cemetery since 1925. This place makes for an especially challenging house tour. It's one of the most visited national parks because anyone who can remember President John F. Kennedy at his grave here in the cemetery can look up with curiosity, climb a hill, and step inside. That original treasury of Washington relics has largely left the building, and it's because the women who lived there thought that they'd have a much better chance of reaching new audiences, becoming appreciated there, and finding national security away from their home. Here's Arlington. It just got a fresh renovation this past June, and I just really can't wait to visit it. They've added a lot of new interpretation about the hundreds of people who lived there, and it looks like there's some new plants to appreciate as well. As much as I wanted this talk to be all about the fierce females in the Custis Lee situation at Arlington who saved amazing objects, George Washington Parke Custis was the curatorial research lead on their illustrious ancestors. As a child at Mount Vernon, he saw how his grandparents used these things, like this storehouse, which we think Washington kept the tents in and aired them out meaningfully after the war. And you can see the will of Martha Washington has left some of the relics to George Washington Parke Custis, their adopted grandson. After inheriting his father's plantation overlooking the Potomac and Washington, Custis designed a temple-like house to be a reliquary and a public-facing entertainment space featuring the Washington Treasury. He worked with historians like Benson Lossing to sketch and publish his history and was always having admirers over to the house. Custis brought the icons he inherited and purchased at Mount Vernon upriver to Arlington, so not too far by boat and even faster by car. And he first calls Arlington Mount Washington. As a theater person, painter, farmer, and veteran who also enslaved hundreds of African Americans who operated multiple estates, the relics were props in his family's play for political and cultural power. He's responsible for early gifts to the Smithsonian, like this pretty famous uniform. And he also gave a toast that apparently made the Marquis de Lafayette cry when remembering that their party tent was used during the Revolutionary War. And he remembered being there with George Washington. Here's what it looks like inside at Arlington prior to its new renovation. You can imagine what kind of conversations happened while Custis was working on amateur copies of famous battle paintings. And you can see there's a lot of other things in the house that would make for good props in his play as well. So who else lived in this house? This is an earlier family tree by the Park Service that with the usual suspects. And I'll go back to them, so don't worry if we don't memorize it now. But I'd really recommend Elizabeth Brown Pryor's book called Reading the Man. The man is Robert E. Lee in that case, but she does go over the family history and the extended family tree that includes the women that Custis had children with, the enslaved women that he had children with during pretty early in his marriage. So those descendants have really been more involved with Arlington in their new interpretation, and it's just another reason to go back and visit and see how this tree has changed. The generations of women at Arlington that I talk about are going to focus on these 4 individuals, and they all find special moments in time to record exchanges about their collection, the Washington Relics. We have Mary Lee Fitzhugh, who marries Custis in 1804. Their only daughter, Mary Anna Randolph, gets married in the parlor to Robert E. Lee. And both of them have enslaved Selina Gray, who also gets married in the parlor to Thornton Gray, and eventually earns her freedom from Custis's will in January of 1862. Lots of other things going on then, which I will talk about. And the oldest daughter of Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee is also named Mary Custis Lee. She's the one out of all of her brothers and sisters who lives the longest, and she's the one who takes care of the Washington relics until her death in 1918. So what kind of projects were they working on at Arlington with the Washington relics? I think we have a new appreciation for how hard it is to work from home. And maybe you found the home edit on Netflix, like I did, as a helpful distraction. Here's this big house project that they inherited along with the relics, and questions about what they might have asked when inspired to declutter this pile of stuff. They might look at each other and say, who remembers this pile of things? Obviously, George Washington Parke Custis remembers a lot of those stories, but maybe they can't handle it all at once, so they have to start with one thing. Well, what is it? We're really lucky that when they look at these objects, they're not inspired by Marie Kondo and asking, does this spark joy for me? We'd be really in trouble if they decided that one chair over another didn't spark joy. They're looking at these things and they're thinking, is it just a regular object? Can I use it? Would it make a great gift for someone else? Should we set it aside and solve this mystery later? They're asking where we got it. Whose is it? Was it George or Martha's or somebody else's at Mount Vernon? Can we still use it? Is it okay to pull out this plate, or are we waiting for an extra special occasion? Or is the Marquis de Lafayette coming for a tent party and we have to put it out? And how do we know what it is? Are there any papers around that can help us figure this out? There might be sets of things. Does it go with something else? You know, I'm looking at one object, but is there another object over here that I should be considering along with it? If we don't know, can we put it somewhere and ask someone? And finally, you know, the family is at Arlington, but they're also asking, you know, cousins and more cousins in Virginia, all over the place, you know, what else should we do with these objects? And does someone else get a vote? Is it really my decision what to do? And if I give it away, will someone else miss it? Sound like pretty familiar questions, I think. And, you know, hopefully we got these cute labels for things, and museum professionals would probably love it if they labeled all these decisions, and sometimes they did. And they're also really focusing on where to keep it safe, where to put it away. So short-term, long-term, there are a lot of options. But the right setting wasn't necessarily these rooms at Arlington. They're trying to figure this out in diary entries, travel accounts, letters, books that they've collected or are reading. And this decision about Arlington or maybe somewhere else took a lot of time and strategy to figure out. These institutions were, a lot of them just starting up, the ones that we know today. And some of them were spontaneous decisions. Other ones were more long-term planning, like in someone's will. As a result, we can't see all the Washington stuff in one place like Custis had wanted for his treasury. When we see these glossy photos of places who care for the relics today, I think we can appreciate times when publicity and marketing power, you know, without a lot of photography, took more than a little elbow grease and personal attention. The value for these things were tied to how people imagine them in association, you know, popular opinion, stories of Southern and national identity over time. These women crowdsourced their collections management decisions with experts, friends, house guests, politicians, and sometimes, you know, just curious, interested strangers. Among other things, I'll mention the bed in which George Washington died, and 2 sets of china, and a hall lantern. And of course, I'll get back to the tent like I promised. I'll focus on these things, and we might mention some other relics in that big pile we saw. So we start here with Mary Fitzhugh Custis. She joins the family in 1804. And the reason we know a little bit more about her perspective is because her granddaughter kept her notebook, or lots of notebooks. This amazing marbled paper notebook has some of the secrets and clues to the service known as the States China, designed for Martha Washington especially. And if you want to know more about the 18th century history of this china, Ron Fuchs, who we heard from it also at this forum, and I have worked on an article about the state service and what this notebook contains about it. And I'll give you a sneak peek in this talk. Starting with her inscription in 1802. Mary is in Alexandria, Virginia. She wasn't always there. She grew up at Chatham Manor. She actually knew Martha Washington through her parents. They had the Washingtons over for dinner at their townhouse in Alexandria, which still stands today. And it looks pretty similar to the house that she goes into at Arlington. So she's used to figuring out, you know, table settings and making decisions about household management. So when she inherits a museum collection to take care of while their house is under construction, we trust her with some pretty big decisions. And one of them is opening this notebook that she started as, you know, a girl learning spelling and punctuation. That's what the rest of this notebook contains. You can see it on the right side of the notebook, but on the other side of the notebook, she's repurposed the blank pages for an inventory of some pretty important stuff, which we recognize as the United States China. In 1806, she writes January remaining and lists an inventory of what's left. So the family is already giving away some of these pieces to people who are interested in Washington's memory. And one of the pieces that Mrs. Custis gives away is in 1824 to a fellow Revolutionary War veteran's wife, Eunice Trumbull. Eunice is in Connecticut and was married to Governor Trumbull. He passed away and she felt like this saucer might cheer her up. And there's a letter that tells, you know, take this little present and take care of it. This china was made at Canton, and especially for General Washington. We know that this was kind of more made for Martha Washington, and there's lots of new research on it, but it's interesting how this is described in a letter so early on in 1824, only a few decades after this inventory. So I'm sure she would have appreciated having some of the new containers to put it in as part of the gift. You know, if you're mailing this china to Connecticut, will it stay safe? And that's just one of the instances and one of her many projects at Arlington with this collection. She does this inventory in 1806, which is not that long, or pretty much around the time that her only surviving daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, is born. She's also part of the family work to host guests and further the name of Washington. She's hosting family guests and even has, you know, she and Robert E. Lee have children, and then those children have friends over, and one of the friends really wants to sleep in the bed in which Washington died and writes home, you know, at Arlington, and I really wanted to sleep in this bed and I wasn't allowed to, but I did take a nap on it. So this is all under the supervision of Mrs. Lee. Mrs. Lee is also visiting a lot of relatives in other places like Mount Vernon. Here we have the inside of the cupola tower at Mount Vernon. I'm sure as a wheelchair user, she would have really appreciated just being able to take a virtual tour of Mount Vernon like we can here. And we know she was there because I think new research has looked at how these boards were used as a guest book for visitors. And one of them says, Mary Custis Lee, Arlington, 1859. And we don't know if that's her or her daughter, but it's really interesting that she's being a tourist on her own family estates as well, before that place even becomes open as an official museum. We've also got, and that timeline is like a little, I'm generalizing, there's like a long history of Mount Vernon that is wonderful to look up. And I think the family is very invested in that becoming a museum, especially when they're living at Arlington, just only a few miles away. One of the pieces that she is looking at in terms of the treasury as possible gifts is this tureen from the Society of Cincinnati China, which is more associated with George Washington than Martha Washington. And she's looking at these pieces, and she really wanted to give away a piece of the state's china like her mother did to a friend whose husband was the ambassador to the Austrian Empire, but that friend was out of luck. So they decided that she would send a small tureen of Cincinnati because she can't send you a whole piece of the state's china. Broken ones would give it a very imperfect idea of the device. The Society of Cincinnati China, she says, are getting very rare, and it's almost like parting with one of my family to send it so far. Present it where you think it will be most prized. She's looking for a home where people will see it. At Arlington, she's also working on her father's papers and making them published into recollections. So she brings back Benson Lossing, and she claims co-authorship on the recollections of George Washington Parke Custis. He's got a lot of papers and she's really interested in them, so we get to read them now. In 1861, she has a few new priorities at home when her husband, Robert E. Lee, takes a new job. She's warned to pack up the house, and she has just enough time to send some china across the river to Georgetown to her cousins. There's a new book about her cousins called A Georgetown Life. She also sends some silver to Lexington, Virginia, and if you'd like to learn more about that, all that detective work is on Mount Vernon's website. And for everything else, she leaves Arlington's treasury under the lock and key of Selina Gray. Selina Gray, as caretaker of the estate, knows that Mrs. Lee and General McDowell, the Union general occupying Arlington, had an agreement that no one would go in the house. That doesn't really go according to plan. As you can see here, we've got a soldier with his feet up on some furniture in the girls' room, roughing it at Arlington. General McDowell goes to Selina Gray and asks her what is happening in terms of the Washington items. The lock has been broken and they're both invested in saving them. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about Selina's perspective on this, since the testimony comes from an 1870 petition from Mrs. Lee to the government asking for these objects back. And General McDowell gives testimony, but Selina Gray does write in her own words to Mrs. Lee after the war, giving her a piece of a rosebud from her mother's grave. So that's Mrs. Custis's grave there at Arlington. Some of the objects that go missing in the report is this amazing bowl with a ship in it, they call it. And that bowl actually ended up in the Union soldiers' hands while occupying Arlington. His sister decides that it belonged at Mount Vernon. And you can see it there. It's still part of a private collection. We also have new archaeology on the site that proves that, yes, some of the china was broken. And we don't know when this happened, but it's interesting to think about. Selina Gray was part of sending the Washington relics to the United States Patent Office. This is now the National Portrait Gallery. These things actually become part of an exhibit called Captured at Arlington, which is maybe a blockbuster name for 1861 and 1862. They are on display there, and then they end up being acquired and moved to various versions of the Smithsonian Institution as it's just being formed. And now when you go visit Arlington, they've really expanded the interpretation of Selina Gray, and once again, just her decision-making and the few letters by her that survive and the legacies that she left behind are still very much of interest to researchers today. This is a exhibit review for that Captured at Arlington exhibit. They say that, you know, George Washington's items belong to the whole country and they shouldn't have been left in the general, some articles say, rebel general's house. They belong to everyone. So that makes the news as people are occupying Arlington during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, this house has become a cemetery. And if you want to read more about the politics involved there, I recommend this book, Politics of Mourning. And it's just amazing visually how it looks kind of the same, and its meaning as a national cemetery as opposed to a private home with a kind of public agenda, national memory, can be compared with its current purpose. You know, that's all part of the landscape's iconography today. These women are really comparing notes after the war to figure out what happened to those things. And they've got some press to motivate them because the government and Congress does not want to give those objects back into private hands, especially in the Lee family, even though they descended through Martha Washington and Mrs. Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee. They've all found new places to live during the war. We've got Mrs. Lee at Washington and Lee, or then Washington College. We've got Selina Gray has moved a few miles away with her children. One of her children's houses is on the National Register of Historic Places, not that far away. Miss Mary Custis Lee, the oldest daughter, gets sent back on an errand to report on what's all still at the estate. And she's, of course, living out of this trunk and traveling the world. A lot of people have gotten used to these objects on display, though, as big exhibits. So they're really not sure about the family taking them away, and they've all gained new meaning, mostly with the first president, George Washington, but also with this captured at Arlington title. During the war, they go to New York as part of a sanitary fair benefiting Union troops. See some familiar objects on display. We've also got them at the Centennial in Philadelphia. Our tent looks a little different there. We see the photo version of that engraving I showed you. And things have gotten a lot more complicated because this new Smithsonian institution wants to keep collecting George Washington's things, and other branches of the family have sold their relics and make this a much bigger accession item. So Nellie Parke Custis's things and her descendants all are added to the pile. And the people who are visiting are still raving about it in the 1890s and seeing these objects on display. One of those people is Miss Mary Custis Lee. She shows up at the Smithsonian and she tries to write down and remember what exactly her family had at Arlington. And she has kind of a hazy memory of some of the chairs. She really makes the curators go, and all the other things. The curators are all interested in who she is. Her letters get forwarded all the way to the top and then to the Secretary of the Interior and then the president. And everyone, needs to figure out how to return these objects or not to the family. Finally, in 1901, President McKinley gives them back to the Lee family. This power of attorney from Lee's brother. He's working on getting the plantation figured out because that's not theirs anymore. And this packing slip from 1901 is all going into storage because Miss Lee is living abroad and she needs to decide what to do with all of the relics. Some of the things she can wear, like this amazing brooch made out of one of Washington's agate buttons. She's really giving interviews about being General Lee's daughter, but also Martha Washington's descendant at this time. There's an article in 1907 that is wonderfully, I just love the text on this article, Relics of George Washington, with all of these illustrations that are actually photos of the objects taken by the Smithsonian. So playing a little matching game, one of them is the bed in which Washington died, and here's a a book of common prayer that was given to Mary Custis Lee by her mother and is inscribed in 1901. So she's clearly thinking about generations at Arlington and carrying on different legacies. The bed is something that was promised to Mount Vernon, and Mount Vernon expresses interest in it after talking. So Mrs. Lee had wanted the bed to go back to Mount Vernon, and that's a project that they all work on. It eventually gets donated in 1908. She's also working really closely with her sister, Mildred. Someone's having a better time than the other sister at this White Sulphur Springs party in 1890. In 1905, Mildred unexpectedly dies in New Orleans, and she's really the more, I would say, beloved by the public daughter of Robert E. Lee. She gets more invitations than her older sister, Mary. At this Mardi Gras in 1884, Mildred was invited to be the Queen of Comus. Mary was just on the court. And Mildred's really interested in Virginia history and has taken on a lot of projects with the Virginia Museum or the Confederate Museum in Richmond. Mary Custis Lee, wearing a different brooch this time with a not so miniature of her dad, is taking on that project, curating the Virginia room for her sister, also really interested in the Home for Needy Confederate Women that opens around this time. And a lot of their things are in the collections at the American Civil War Museum because of this. At the same time, she's thinking about the sacred relics that could aid her charity. Reverend Burke, the founder of the museum, now the Museum of the American Revolution, is working on a project to fundraise for Washington Memorial Chapel in Valley Forge before there was a national park. He reads the interview that Mary gives from Atlantic City and wants some of Washington's tents, but there's more than one and he can only afford one of them. And the letters between them are trying to figure out this puzzle. Miss Mary Custis Lee was given an inventory in 1906 by the Smithsonian curators about what was rightfully hers, but left there in storage. So by now it's considered a loan to the Smithsonian or the National Museum, the Washington Relics from Arlington Mansion. And there's a lot of tent pieces that they list. She also has seen that some of the curators at the Smithsonian have set them up on the lawn. So maybe she doesn't really want those tents to be in the Smithsonian anymore. We don't really know what she was thinking, but she felt like Reverend Burke had a good patriotic cause to bring them back to Valley Forge, and she had really hoped to visit. Reverend Burke does his best guesswork, brings back a tent, some poles that might be a little too tall for it, and that's a puzzle that we're still figuring out through the first Oval Office project at the museum today. The vision for the tent in the Valley Forge case is something that inspires the design for the Allen B. Miller Theater. And there's still all those tent pieces I mentioned, they end up in other collections and are all part of the interpretation plans of these institutions. The one on the bottom right is at Yorktown. Some smaller pieces, but a little more breakable, is the Society of Cincinnati China. Mary Custis Lee gives them on loan to the Virginia museum called Battle Abbey, which is then the Confederate Museum. She wants these as a loan exhibit during her lifetime and works with the curators there at the Association of Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. And they're very grateful to talk about great Virginians all together, Washington and Lee. She leaves them in her will to some nieces and nephews who eventually sell it to Henry Francis DuPont at Winterthur Museum. It's the largest collection of this porcelain in one place. She also hangs back a little bit. She gives a States China plate from Martha Washington's set and one plate from the Society of Cincinnati to the White House collection when it's first getting started. She meets the Wilson presidency at the White House and gives away these plates as a gift. And at that time, you know, the public audience is less of a thing than the Presidential Association, who will appreciate the Washington China. Later in life, you know, she's become members of all kinds of organizations. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, the DAR has made her a member of the Revolutionary Relics Committee, all kinds of articles about her. She's also, of course, interested in the collections at Washington and Lee. One of the places she's asked to be a member of and declines is the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, but she does think of them with this pilgrimage to Mount Vernon. Some big fans of Mount Vernon might see there's a missing thing in the stairwell that the tourists are looking up at. And Mary Custis Lee is the one that fixes that problem. In 1915, she gives this hall lantern back to Mount Vernon, where it was before her grandfather took it to Arlington. She felt like that was the rightful place to be. We have some curatorial notes on what she was like giving that gift. And then just, you know, other than the hall lantern, there's so many other stories and institutions that the family creates, but without people around to tell stories about these objects and engaged audiences to listen and agree on what they meant, the Washington relics could be pretty lifeless. Any one of us who might have inherited an object is not quite sure what it is could relate to this story. Does the thing come with a note? Do you remember where your ancestor kept it? Maybe it's something you only put out when family visited and otherwise kept it hidden away, just to be polite. That's what happened to the Washington relics. Without candid photos, quick notes, or museum catalogs, some of these items were more valuable for the memories they evoked, whether or not that memory historically happened. Each family member could testify to national audiences and assign value to their favorite things on their own. Americans can guess that there must be things that the Washingtons wore and touched, but the sentiment that that belongs in a museum is really relatively new. The Custis Lees shaped those legacies for their family, and they really personalized and published lore for a curious public, north and south, and knew they could make headlines by where they placed each object. Their curatorial actions influenced private and public collections all over. And today, these museums can take on the mission that started in the family. At special moments between 1802 and 1918, Arlington women took action to save the relics as ordinary foundations that promised an extraordinary future for the United States. It's a big task with lots of small steps, lots of small decisions, and other people weighing in as well. Without the stories saved by these Southern women, we wouldn't have the same set of national icons. The marketing heading for this article, which I complimented how pretty it is, it's really only one version of why these things are important. These artifacts and artworks raise awareness of other important people associated with the Washington success, including the women who contributed to that legacy. Their collective quick thinking, taking ownership of key decisions in sometimes stressful moments, made a national impact before and after the Civil War. How much of an impact do these women have on how these things were interpreted over time? And I guess we'll just have to keep visiting these places to find out. Thank you so much to everyone at these collections who have helped me with my research, and to Historic New Orleans for the invitation to join the Antiques Forum this year. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you again.
The Historic New Orleans Collection would like to thank Arnaud's Restaurant for its long-standing support of the New Orleans Antiques Forum. Located at 813 Bienville Street, Arnaud's has offered classic Creole cuisine and exemplary service since 1918. Learn more at arnaudsrestaurant.com.